Imagine a world where the essential products that we use every month because they are essential to use for a natural, uncontrollable bodily function. Imagine now that those products are laced with harmful chemicals. And that's not even a distant dystopian nightmare. It is a reality that menstruating people are facing right now, today, with modern period care products. Despite advances in technology and healthcare, the very items marketed as safe and hygienic have turned out to be sources of toxic exposure, all in the name of convenience and profit. This year, alarming studies have surfaced revealing that several popular tampon brands contain toxic metals like lead, arsenic, and cadmium. The 2024 study led by researchers at UC Berkeley found that tampons used by millions of people every month could expose users to these harmful substances. These findings are not just shocking but infuriating, considering the decades of unregulated production and lack of transparency from manufacturers. When this study came out, I started seeing nearly every news outlet covering it, and I became really infuriated as a menstruating person, but also as someone who owns a reusable period underwear brand. I use reusable period underwear instead of single-use alternatives because they reduce waste and they save me money. But I started realizing that people are turning to disposable products because they think that that is the best option for them. It's a thing they've been presented with. And now to find out that they are also risking their health because of those same products, I wanted to figure out how the hell we got here. And there are many different ways to explore that, but for me, I was really interested in how period care started, presumably how it used to be a very natural thing, and how we advanced to where we are now in modern society where these essential products are found to have heavy metals in them. And I went all the way back from the natural products of ancient civilizations to the invention of disposable products during the Industrial Revolution. And surprise, surprise, in the 20th century, the introduction of disposable products marked the beginning of a new era of convenience. However, with convenience came the use of synthetic materials and chemicals, setting the stage for the toxic products we see today. But as I already prefaced, and as I'm sure I will say throughout this video, those toxic single-use disposable things that can get expensive are not the only option. There are reusable options out there. K&S, the brand that I own of reusable period underwear, is just one of the options. But I think before we get into the study, we'll talk about alternative methods and we'll talk about all of that. But before we get into it, knowing that there are studies where most products tested had these harmful chemicals in them, I think we should say right up front that there are alternatives that exist and you do not have to continue using those wasteful, harmful ones. But the goal of today's video is to answer the question that is in the title: how period care became toxic. So we're winding it back to ancient times. We're talking 1550 BCE. Obviously, there weren't manufacturers back then. There weren't synthetic chemicals or materials being used in period care products. And period care back in the day was like very, very taboo. It was a topic that is not well documented because it wasn't talked about very much. But it makes sense that people all over the world, depending on what resources were available to them, were using all sorts of different things before products were created for people to use on their period. So the earliest form of period care that I could find was in ancient Egypt, because that is where the oldest medical document that we have comes from. That document is called the Ebers Papyrus, and that is an ancient Egyptian medical text which includes references to menstruation and describes the use of linen tampons for menstrual care. Obviously, they didn't use the word tampon because that didn't exist back then, but essentially what we can see is that they were using linen, and also papyrus was documented as things that they were using to care for their periods. In ancient Greece and Rome, we see that lint wrapped around wood was used. It was inserted for absorption, as well as lamb's wool, because that is what they had available to them. In ancient China and Japan, folded paper was commonly used, particularly in Japan, and silk in wealthier regions was something used for its softness. In the Middle East, early forms of cotton cloth were used for menstruation. Native American tribes used moss because it was absorbent, and that was a common choice, but also buffalo skin and grass. Indigenous African cultures were found to have used sea sponges, and then obviously grass and leaves. Northern Europe has been said to use rabbit fur because it was very absorbent, and flax fibers were woven into cloth pads of sorts. And we start to see a lot of these materials repeating because, like I said, it is essentially what they had available to them. So in South America, they would use cotton and plant fibers. Indigenous peoples used wool from alpacas and llamas because that's what that region has available. In Southeast Asia and like Oceania, they found to use bark cloth, which was made from the inner bark of certain trees, and plant leaves, which makes sense, right? So those materials and what people were using is from 1550 BCE. The amount of documentation or innovation or changes that I could find throughout my search was virtually none until the 1900s, which I find mind-blowing. As someone who menstruates, I think about functioning in the world, especially in a world where you don't have conveniences. Like, you are providing for yourself, and what your body is able to do in most cases is how you would drink and eat and bathe and be sheltered. Like, all of those things were very dependent on your abilities or, you know, your family and your tribe. Like, people lived much more communally back then. But I just think about trying to function as a human being without proper period care, and the fact that there was like essentially no innovation. And I think like in modern times currently, where I'm talking to you from, like, periods are still kind of stigmatized in a weird way. It's still kind of a hush-hush topic, but I think because that has kind of been that way throughout history, it just is not something that was really taken care of, and we don't really hear of, there was no evidence of other innovations until the 1900s, where menstrual belts enter the chat. So that's where we are. It's not certain when the like actual concept of a menstrual belt came about. It is assumed, or I guess their best guess is that it came about in medieval Europe. Also, going from the thought of like not having period care and using things like leaves and sticks as period care is like, whoa, but so too is a menstrual belt. Like, I think about how comfortable my period underwear are, and thinking about having to wear a leather belt on my period is like, sounds terrible. And throughout my research, I did find that menstruating people back in the day had far fewer periods than we do now, due to things like malnutrition, and also because people had so many more kids back then that there was like a significant amount of their menstruating time, like when people are menstruating, that they were actually pregnant or having kids, so they just had less periods. So maybe the leather belt thing to them just wasn't as a problem. But me and my comfortable period underwear, I'm not interested in that. They were either made of cloth or leather. Which one would you prefer? And they were typically handmade. So these were things that like people would own one of, and they were perfectly custom fit to your body. And then they would have the ability to take out reusable cloths. We're not in the disposable era yet. We'll get there. Essentially, that is what period care looks like for a long time. And then throughout my research, it took me days to find this information. The first patent that was given out by the United States government for the adjustable menstrual belt was created by a Black woman. Her name was Mary Kenner, and yeah, we should say her freaking name, because Kenner's idea of a sanitary belt would hold pads in place, preventing them from shifting when people were on the move and causing blood leakage. Essentially, before that, people would wrap the cloth around the belt, and there were no like ability to hold it in place. And her invention included a moisture-proof napkin pocket, which helped prevent leaks and improve hygiene for menstruating people. The belt also featured easily adjustable straps, considering the comfort of individual users, which we already talked about how frustrating it would have been to have a leather belt specifically fitted to your body, and also to have something that was not able to adjust for bloat, or if you change sizes, if you had a child, if your circumstances in life changed. It obviously was something that made sense to create, and it was created by someone who is for some reason left out of a lot of the history of this. Not for some reason, we know why, but you know what I mean. However, the patent processing was costly, and although Kenner had thought up the sanitary belt in the 1920s, she could not get the idea patented until 1956. So despite this significant and important advancement in menstrual care, Kenner faced significant racial and gender bias. Initially, big companies, rumored to be Playtex and also another one called the Sewn Nap Pack Company, were interested in investing in her invention, but when they discovered that she was African American, they declined to market her product. At the time, she held the record for most patents awarded to an African American woman by the US government, which is really impressive. So I have to include her. She's basically a hero. Then we come to the birth of disposable period products. Yay! So the first commercially produced disposable period products were called Lister's towels, and they came onto the market around 1888. Named after the renowned surgeon Joseph Lister, who pioneered antiseptic surgery, these towels marked a significant advancement in menstrual hygiene products. As much as disposable anything bothers me. We know this. I do also have to say that that really liberates a menstruating person from constantly having to change and then care for their materials when the just like natural, uncontrollable bodily function that you have is so taboo. Not having to deal with all of the care surrounding it, I'm sure the creation of disposables at the time was very liberating for people who menstruate. Lister's towels were made of cotton and gauze and designed to be disposable after one use. And they were sold in discreet packaging to make it easier for women to purchase them without embarrassment. What I learned throughout this, because of this topic being so like hush hush, is that they would sell products at the pharmacy in paper bags. Like they had tables set up in the pharmacy. They would put the disposable products that they were selling in brown paper bags, unlabeled, unmarked, and there was a jar on the table where people would drop in the money that they were paying for those products so that people could come in, get one, drop their money, and run out without ever having to talk to anyone or being super embarrassed to be purchasing those things. And I think up until I switched to reusable products, I felt very like ugh about going to the store and buying like the pads and those sort of things, thinking that people would just think it was weird when I checked out. I don't know that that fear was real, but it was like in my mind. So I just thought that was interesting that that was like how people were getting these things back in the day. Things really got better for menstruating people around the end of World War I, because this is when we started to see the invention of cellulose, I guess you say pads or napkins. They kind of use that word interchangeably, liner, napkin, pad. I don't really know what the difference is in all of those things, but around World War I, obviously there were many bandages needed for wounded soldiers and those sort of things. And after the war ended, we had warehouses full of this cellulose material that they were using to make bandages to soak up blood. So wouldn't it just make sense that those materials could be used to soak up menstruating people's blood? I don't know. Apparently not. Apparently that did not cross their minds until they had warehouses full of this material and they needed something to do with them, to make a profit, to not lose their money, to get a return on their investment, because that's how our world works. Or I should say that's how our country works anyway. The American company Kimberly-Clark, which had supplied cellulose bandages during the war, saw an opportunity to create a new product for menstrual care. They repurposed the surplus cellulose to produce disposable sanitary pads. And in 1920, Kimberly-Clark introduced Kotex, the first commercially successful disposable sanitary napkin. And fun fact, the name Kotex comes from combining the words cotton-like texture. Kotex. So at this point, we are really still in the stages of using, like I said, napkins, pads, liners, because there was this other misconception that using a tampon would mess with your purity, like purity culture and being like virgin-like and all those sort of things was really still like one of the most important things to people. And it was thought of that inserting something to care for your period would somehow disturb that. And so we're still at the point where, like I said, liners, napkins, whatever you want to call it, that is the preferred method of caring for your period. But also at this time, like when I'm saying that, when Kotex was created, where these cellulose pads were being used, they don't have adhesive. They're just disposable pads that would, I guess, go in your underwear, but there's nothing holding them in place. So then we get to the 1920s, 1930s. That's when we start to see the, I guess, like the acceptance of tampons and alternatives to the cloth napkins, pads, those sort of things. In the early 1930s, Dr. Earl Haas, an American physician, developed the modern applicator tampon. He received a patent for it in 1931, and this tampon included a cardboard applicator to help insert the tampon without touching it directly, which was a significant innovation for hygiene and ease of use. So Dr. Earl Haas invents this applicator, but it is then purchased by a woman. Dr. Haas's tampon was brought to market by a business woman, Gertrude Tentrick, who purchased the patent and founded the Tampax company in 1936. And Tampax became the first commercially successful tampon brand and revolutionized the menstrual product market. So Gertrude actually purchased this patent with money from her own savings. She had no like big business behind her. Like we know the name Tampax is such a huge business today, but the founding of these products by a woman, a businesswoman who purchased that patent, she just did it with her own savings. She just wanted to see the development of period care for menstruating people, okay? So I thought that was a cool little part of history. We love a businesswoman. That was the first time I had really seen that word used throughout my research, so I kind of like that. even though we're talking about disposables, which fast forward to the 2000s is just a little bit frustrating. But back in the day, they couldn't have really seen what we see now. So we have to talk about it from that perspective a little bit. Tampax quickly gained popularity due to its innovative design, which offered women a more comfortable and convenient alternative to the menstrual products available at the time. From what I can find, Tampax is also who introduced the use of cotton into menstrual care products. Before that, it was like the cellulose, and we talked about linen and cloth and all those sort of things, but cotton, Tampax is kind of the leader of introducing that material to menstrual care products. And their marketing strategy is the biggest reason for their success, because like I said at the time, inserting something into you was seen as like problematic, bad, something people did not want to do. So Tampax got to work on combating that misinformation and educating their customers on the ease of usage and safety. And without that sort of strategy, I don't think we would see tampons in the way that we do today. I honestly don't even think that we would see the destigmatization of periods to the extent that we do today if Gertrude hadn't taken that marketing approach to bring Tampax to the market and make it be successful. But because they chose to focus their marketing efforts on education, that is the core of how they became successful. As the demand for Tampax grew, the company expanded its production capabilities and distribution networks. Tampax became widely available in pharmacies and stores across the United States and eventually internationally. But as all of these disposables were coming onto market, there was a reusable version, okay, throughout all of this happening, and it was called the Tacit Cup. The Tacit was a reusable menstrual cup made from rubber. It was decided to be inserted to collect menstrual blood rather than absorb it like tampons or pads. And it was offered as a money-saving and environmental-saving product at the time. But Tampax really had their marketing game on lock. I mean, they had really good educational information throughout their marketing. Like I said, they had a robust marketing system that way. And they had discreet packaging, which to people back then was really important. And the Tacit just didn't have that level of visibility and support. So it never developed the means, the money to be able to market itself at the level that Tampax did. That is how we end up with disposables, single use becoming the norm. And the development of this and this whole story that we're telling about menstrual care products and those sort of things, I think begins a very significant and important trajectory of realizing that people can make money from women. In today's economy, current day 2024, women drive so much of the consumer economy. And before this era that we're talking about around the 1920s, 1930s, they were not seen as a significant part of the consumer economy. But the commercial success of Tampax really propelled women as being like the ideal consumer and someone that marketing could, in some cases, manipulate, in some cases, just like educate and tell the story to. But this really, I think, cemented women as the drivers of the consumer economy. It gets even better because then the invention of adhesives comes on the market. So this product was developed by Johnson & Johnson, and I specifically wanted to know what team, what people, whose names could I attach to the creation of Stay Free, which is the first adhesive pad on the market. But there is no person or team, there are no names behind the invention of this adhesive pad. It is just the corporation Johnson & Johnson. Do we know who created that in a lab, in a I don't know, a facility one day? We really don't, at least not that I could find, but we do know that it was Johnson & Johnson, and we do know that they knew how to make it profitable. So Johnson & Johnson developed Stay Free, and it was founded in 1971. So that is how recent like adhesive pads have been available, which is like kind of a long time ago, but also kind of not, because my mom would have been like getting close to menstruating age at that time. Like, think about that. Some of our moms were alive. Well, actually, a lot of you watching this, your mom was probably alive before the invention of an adhesive pad existed. And think about just how normalized it is now, right? In our culture. I think it's interesting to see how quickly things can happen like that. So the invention of Stay Free was 1971. That's where we're at. But we fast forward a bit to 1985, which is when the first time the word period was spoken on television. And it was, of course, in a commercial.
Does your life change once a month because of your period? Remember, there's a feeling with Tampax. It can actually change the way you feel about your period.
I just can't believe how recently that is. Like, I was born 8 years after that. That is wild. It is wild how stigmatized something that is so natural, and I can't emphasize enough, uncontrollable, was taboo. But between 1970 and now, not a whole lot happened, except for the early 2000s, we started to see a rise of environmentalism. There has been more of an adoption of the reusable versions, like the reusable period underwear that I talked about, the menstrual cup, which I know plenty of people who use and do love, but it's not the majority of people. Disposables and single use is very, very normal. So in this video, I think it makes sense to talk about how much waste is generated by the normalization of these single use products. How many disposable period products does the average person use in their lifetime? The menstrual cycle length is around 28 days and the average menstruation period there is 5 days. And the estimated amount of products used per day is 4 to 6, tampons or liners, either one. And currently the menstruating age is from 12 to 50, which is about 38 years. So 12 cycles a year times 38 years at 5 products per day, which is around 25 products per cycle, equals around 300 single-use products per year. Multiply that by 38 years, and you get around 11,400 single-use disposable period products used throughout a menstruating person's lifetime. And that number seems like a lot, because it is. That is a lot of single-use disposable products. But I find that a lot of times when people bring up this number in this conversation, it is mostly focused around waste, because yes, those products end up in landfills or in our sewage system or in our oceans, our water, and all of that is a concern, yes, but there are so many more concerns because the creation of those products also has a significant impact on the planet. So I wanted to outline some of the things that have to happen in order to get those single-use products that we use on average 11,000 of in our lifetimes. So raw material sourcing, like point blank period, a lot of raw materials have to be sourced for not only the cotton in the materials, but also the cardboard used, if it's a cardboard applicator, and the packaging that those things come in, the plastic that comes in, plastic applicators, all those sort of things. There's so many raw materials that have to be sourced for, including paper, which requires deforestation, clear cut land to grow the type of trees that we use to cut down to make paper. And that leads to deforestation, loss of biodiversity, habitat loss. All of that is associated with these single-use products. And then there's cotton, which has a plethora of issues growing it. It is one of the dirtiest crops in the world. It requires a ton of land, a ton of water. And so apart from the land use and the water use for the cotton, there is the pesticides, the herbicides, the killing of all of the microorganisms and the insects, and how that impacts the food chain when we use those materials to grow single-use products. Have to keep that in mind. And then there's the impact of bleaching the cotton. The dioxins used for bleaching impact our water sources and accumulate in the food chain. And I talked about water use used to grow all of these materials, but there's also significant water use in the manufacturing process. To take something from a crop to a material takes a significant amount of water. And speaking of the water use in the manufacturing process, there is also the energy use in the manufacturing process, along with other greenhouse gas emissions, which leads to pollution and climate change. And then there's transportation emissions, not only to get the cotton from farm to the manufacturer, but then to get it from the manufacturer to all over the world. And then there's improper disposal, which leads to all sorts of water pollution issues, including microplastics, marine debris, which harms wildlife and then the entire ecosystem. And there are all of these additives that seep into the natural environment that lead to hormone disruption. Even if you're not the person using disposables and the materials, the chemicals that are in them lead to hormone disruption for other people, which yes, hormone disruption from these chemicals that are used in period products is a problem for humans, but it has also been found to be a problem for wildlife. And then there's like landfill use, which yeah, filling up our landfills with disposable materials, I already said is a problem, but we don't often talk about the transportation needed to get products from your home to the landfill and the emissions that come along with that and the materials needed to create the trucks. Like it is never ending, the impacts of the way that the things that we buy impact the planet. It is never ending. It is impossible to conceptualize how much impact the things that we buy have on the planet, let alone disposable products used for a very small period of time that will be on this planet for a long time, but the impacts to make those things is even longer and incomprehensible. And so we know there are significant environmental impacts from single-use products, single-use period products, but there are also health impacts. Is kind of the jumping off point for me wanting to make this video. So let's go over the study that happened this year that found a lot of metals and toxins in period care products. So the scope of the study were 30 tampons from 14 brands and 18 product lines analyzed for 16 metalloids, but they did not name any of the brands, which I'm not really sure I understand why or how maybe the legal system works, because of how sue happy people are in this country in particular, and how frustrating it is that corporations have that ability, not adhere to being transparent or regulations that may exist. But then when someone calls you out for it and finds you guilty of it, you can sue them, even though you're definitely the one in the wrong. So these are the 16 metal or metalloids that they tested for, but they were particularly looking for 3 that are really important, which is lead, arsenic, and cadmium. I don't want to say that wrong, and I'm not super familiar with that one like I am with lead and arsenic, but they don't sound good. And the findings were that all 30 tampons from 14 different brands tested positive for at least one of those 16 metals that they tested for. This I found very weird and concerning, but higher lead concentrations were in the non-organic tampons and higher levels of arsenic were in the organic tampons. And the researchers said that the metals could enter tampons through contaminated raw materials like the cotton that we talked about, or could be added intentionally for odor control, pigmentation, or antibacterial purposes. And the study emphasized that the material around where you insert tampons is much more absorbent, probably that too, but that area is much more absorbent than most of our body. And statistics say that between 50 and 80% of menstruating people use tampons for their period care. Some of the long-term health risks associated with these materials are things like dementia, infertility, diabetes, and of course, cancer. Also damage to your liver, kidneys, brain, cardiovascular, nervous, and endocrine systems. So yeah, basically everything. And I think that everyone should be so outraged that, number one, a study like this has not really been done before. I was reading that this is like the first study of its kind, and also that these brands are not more transparent about what they are adding and what is in these things, and also that there are not regulations already existing to prevent this. The fact that it is 2024 and this is when we're finding out about this is when like regulations hopefully will be created after more studies like this are done, hopefully soon. We should all be outraged about it. We should all be very, very angry that all of those realities exist. We should be demanding that products do not have that. We should be demanding that the companies that we give our money to are more transparent with what they are putting in those products. And I really don't think that regulation should have to exist to say that lead and arsenic should not be in those products that we're paying for. But hell, if we have to create legislation to make sure that it's not, we should be demanding that they do that. We should absolutely be fighting for those things, because even though I don't use those products, I haven't in a very long time, I know that the majority of menstruating people do, and the fact that we are being subjected to those things against our will, against our knowledge really, is infuriating. So with all of that in context and the fact that this study didn't name any brands, I can't necessarily be like, don't go support one of these 30 tampons that were found to have these materials in them, because we don't know exactly who they are. But I just wouldn't feel comfortable spending my money on absolutely any of them at this point until there's enough transparency and testing to say that the thing that I'm buying doesn't have that in it. And at the end of the day, I think that's what I advocate for on this channel in my life. It's how I like to live my life, is not giving money to people who I do not trust and who I do not want to see do more of whatever they're doing. I do not want to see more companies profiting at the cost of people's health, and I do not want to vote with my dollar for more of that to happen. So at the end of the day, I would just remove my money from that altogether. If you're watching this video, I hope that you have found a reusable version for your menstrual care at this point, but if you haven't, I obviously own a brand of reusable period underwear, and I think they are the most comfortable ones that you are ever going to find. But we also strive to be inclusive, and we are tested for PFAS, and it's up on our website so that you can see that test. We try to do our best to be transparent, and when you vote with your dollar, you absolutely should be voting for companies who have that transparency. Aside from that, because we know between 50 and 80% of menstruating people are using these tampons, we also should be advocating for transparency from those brands, and we also should be advocating for regulations around this or laws. We should be advocating to hold those people accountable who are doing that, and also be advocating for more studies and more funding to be done in this area. Those are all of the takeaways and like calls to actions I've got for you, but I hope you did find this really informative or entertaining, or kind of like made you more aware of what's going on in the world so that you can tell someone else about it. So send this video to another menstruating person who absolutely needs to hear it. And because of the topics that we talked about and because of the solutions to those topics, today I want to leave you off with do your best and advocate for the rest. Bye, guys.